Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second last webinar for the season for Fall 2019 Social Entrepreneurship for Innovation in Health. The course, as you know, is part of Global Making More Health Initiative, which is a partnership between BI and Ashoka. And we will continue our discussion from the last session on co-creation. And this week's subject is idea development and pitching. But before we jump onto the session, you are aware what you have to do actually. You have to take the live survey, which you can see below the video, which asks if you're watching us live, please say yes. And you get extra point for watching us live. In case you cannot, we will be available. The video is going to be available for watching later. And I am very pleased to welcome Mark Cheng, who is an expert in the subject. He is the director of Europe and Asia of Ashoka. He is an expert on social finance. He comes with an investment banking track record, and so far he has facilitated over $200 million investment into social ventures. So it is a very interesting, I will say, journey that he has held so far. Welcome, Mark. Welcome to the session.
Hi, Andrani. Thank you so much. And it's great to be here with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Mark, we will like to start the session with the question on your professional journey. We understand that you have a investment banking background, you are working on social financing, and you are continuing to do that. So, which means that you have been in the heart of economy, the heart of mathematics. So, I'm sure that you will have very important observation right from your education to where you are. Can you tell a little bit about that? I mean, your journey so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So firstly, I should say, and this is probably true for many people on this call, my journey's been a bit of a surprise to me, to be honest, in a pleasant way. I never expected that I would be working in social enterprise and social innovation. But I always, I studied economics as my degree, and then finance, and then I went into investment banking, and I began my first job with Deutsche Bank in the late 90s. And I was essentially doing a lot of project finance. I was running around the world helping build power plants and roads and infrastructure of different kinds. And I always thought that I might get involved with development in some way. That was kind of the direction that I was thinking about from a social impact perspective. And actually, one of the sort of the early moments for me that started me on this journey was a friend of mine lent me a copy of a book, which was the autobiography of Professor Muhammad Yunus, who's the founder of the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, which was the first microfinance bank. And it was a really eye-opening book for me. It was a story about basically an economics professor who creates his own institution to lend to poor, illiterate women in Bangladesh in the late 80s. And he actually turns it into a successful business model, which then transforms the lives of literally hundreds of millions of people. And over the next 30 years, the microfinance movement grows into this global movement, which has now lifted more than 500 million people out of poverty. And that was kind of like a real sort of wow moment for me, that actually you could use business in this way and impact the lives of so many people. But the truth was that it wasn't until 2007, 2008 that I decided to make actually follow up on this. And what prompted me to do that was, well, to be honest, it was the financial crisis in 2007, which essentially closed down the debt markets for a significant number of industries for long periods of time. And so the team that I was working in suddenly saw our pipeline drying up. And that was really the sort of the prompt for me to start thinking, well, what else could I be doing? And I really wanted to take my skills and use them in an interesting way, in a career and in a path that I would find personally more fulfilling. And it was at that time that I came across this organization called Ashoka. And as many of you know, what Ashoka is, it's a global network of the world's leading social entrepreneurs. So every year, Ashoka elects 120 social entrepreneurs into its global fellowship around the world in more than 90 countries now. And the common thread that each of them have in common is that they're all innovators in different ways. Some of them are entrepreneurs, some of them are NGO leaders, some of them are for-profit business leaders, but they all have this in common. They are all creating massive social impact, and they are all highly innovative in how they do it. So they're all, reaching millions of people with their ideas. These are people like Teach for America, which has now become Teach for All, many different healthcare projects around the world. And so I came across this organization, and I went as a volunteer, and I asked them, hey guys, what is it that you actually need that business people can help you with? And the overwhelming feedback that came back was that social entrepreneurs desperately need help with access to finance. Because if you're a social entrepreneur or a social innovator, the world essentially is not set up to fund people like yourself. And this may resonate with many people on this call. But a social entrepreneur is actually a very strange, type of entity in a way, because on the one hand, there's business involved, using business skills and practices to create impact. But on the other hand, it's also seen as very social, and indeed the social side usually trumps the business side, right? It's about creating impact first, using business as a way of doing that. And so the financial world is not set up for people like that. We're very comfortable with charities, and we know how to fund them. We do that through donations and grants. We are familiar with businesses, but we assume that they profit maximize. We assume that they're about making as much market share as possible. And so the idea that an entrepreneur comes along and says, well, I want to create a business, but I want to reach people who earn less than $2 a day, or I want to go into markets that just simply, don't seem to have the income to support the products and services that we have. It's very strange. And so what happened was that Ashoka connected me with several of their entrepreneurs who were actually already doing this. And one of them was a healthcare entrepreneur, a gentleman named David Green. And David had been an Ashoka Fellow and a social entrepreneur already for many years. What he had done was back in India in the 1990s, David had developed an ultra affordable, low cost intraocular lens, which is the lens that you use in cataract surgery. Every year in India, there are about 5 million people who desperately need this surgery, and the vast majority of them can't afford it. Right? Surgery typically costs at least $3,000. It's prohibitively expensive for people who earn less than $4 a day. So there's many reasons why this population is not being addressed. And David found a way to manufacture and sell these lenses. And at that time, the world price of the lens was $300. He found a way to sell it at $1.20. And so effectively, really brought down the price, which meant that surgeries in India increased from 800,000 a year to 4 million within 8 years. And not only that, but he also then teamed up with a very innovative a social entrepreneur who was developing a new series of eye hospitals in India called Aravind Eye Hospitals. And Aravind's unique model was that they would provide cataract surgeries almost for free to more than half their patients. And they would charge enough on the remaining half to be able to cover the cost for everybody and be profitable as a business, but really one that was trying to reach as many people as possible. So the combination of David's company selling these lenses, working with Aravind, those two solutions, the low-cost lens combined with this cross-subsidized distribution model, was really what led to a revolution in eye care. And so by the time that I met David, this is 2008, he's already been a well-recognized social entrepreneur in this space. And I said, what can I do to help support that? And he said, why don't we team up and go and launch an impact fund that would be able to raise capital and then sponsor hospitals and clinics around the world, predominantly in emerging markets, that would be able to adopt these technologies and roll them out. And he had identified a further 20 technologies, affordable goods and other products that would be able to do this. And so I worked with David and ultimately ended up helping to set up an eye care fund, which at the time was about 15 million euros in size. and using that funding, which came from impact investors. So it was, again, this is 10, 12 years back. So this was a very, very nascent market, which had been unproven. We were able to
Yes.
find projects around the world that could receive those loans and adopt those technologies. And everywhere we went, whether this was Tibet, Mongolia, Nepal, China, Nigeria, we're able to successfully find hospitals that could do that, and they've all done very well since then. So that experience of the ability to marry low cost impact finance with really
Mhm.
innovative technical solutions, medical solutions, was really what kind of changed my career. And I joined Ashoka after that as an in-house social finance advisor, which I remain
Great.
to this day, and have now worked with more than 100 such entrepreneurs around the world and raised over $200 million now in finance for them. So we have a lot of experience now in
Yes.
doing this. And
That was actually one of my question, and you touched upon something very interesting, which is low cost technology or low cost solutions. And I think the world is being taken over with this concept of low cost and affordable solutions. It is no longer something that is only social. It's not only for social implication; it is also for sustainability implications. I think the way the world is going to do business in future is going to be determined by that. But before we come, to those questions, which are really the technicalities, because you mentioned about, like, how you have kind of facilitated millions of dollars into social ventures, I will actually, ask you a question from your specific experience. I'm sure that not all social entrepreneurs are good fundraisers, and every social enterprise will have fundraising, but there are reasons why some people are able to successfully fundraise. It's not because they don't have a good model or it's not innovative. It's really because the way they do fundraising. So what do you think, sets apart those who are successful in kind of attracting investors?
yeah, I think it's several things. I mean, one of the first things to say is that unfortunately, a great idea doesn't necessarily mean it will get funded. And if you look at the projects that get funded and those that don't get funded, unfortunately, there are some wonderful projects that don't make it, and there are others that do succeed. So it's not the idea itself, although that's obviously the most important thing, which is necessarily the challenge. In many cases, what we see is that the entrepreneur struggles to really sell the idea, and you absolutely have to do that if you're going to succeed. And the reason why I think this is hard for some people is that because for many social entrepreneurs, what you have to do is you have to convince the investor of not one thing, but two things, right? So you have to convince them that you have a product or service that will actually be financially viable. And that's what every entrepreneur has to do. But you also have to convince them that your product or service creates social impact. And so it's the ability to sell both of those and explain both of those, which is absolutely key to being able to convince social investors to come on board, because you're appealing automatically to probably a smaller group of investors than would be the case for a broad, commercial proposition, for example, or purely commercial proposition, right? So, and what we see is that many people struggle to do both of those things well. So some people will, spend a lot of time focusing on the product and, tend to really go into that in a lot of detail. But what they fail to connect with is what is the social problem which that product addresses.
Hmm.
And then there's another group of entrepreneurs that we see who predominantly come from the NGO world or the social sector, or they may be actually clinicians themselves. So you may see a doctor or a medical practitioner who's developed a new approach or a new way of tackling a social issue, and they're very, very focused on the problem, but they fail to connect that with, okay, so what's the product itself, right? So they often, describe beautifully the conditions that why malaria spreads, or chronic disease, or whatever it might be, or the conditions of the health system in which they're in, but they're not so concrete when it comes to the actual solution. And so that tends to be a smaller subset. Most people tend to be too product focused, and not enough about the social context. But you kind of see both sides of that, and if you can't hit both of those together convincingly, then that's where many people struggle.
Yes, that's very interesting. Actually, you touched upon something very important, that the idea, innovation, product, and probably the problem. All of these are very, very important. Before, there are a lot of questions already coming from our participants, Mark, which I will start taking. But a very important question that I have, which is more a sectoral question, because you're a senior advisor to making more health initiatives. So we like to understand from you, given the past trends of the past years, what are some of the trends that you see in terms of the appetite for the investors to invest in the health sector? What are they really looking for?
Okay, sure. Well, one of the things that I'm personally finding most exciting is that I think this is potentially the golden age of investment into healthcare.
Mhm.
And I think that a lot of investors are waking up to this, and they're seeing the opportunities. And they're seeing the opportunities in parts of the world and in sectors that we previously hadn't seen before. You know, emerging markets, low income, sub-Saharan Africa, seeing enormous interest now in investing in health systems in East Africa, South Africa, West Africa, all over, in fact. And I know there are many colleagues joining us from, you know, Africa, and that part of the world. So I think it's hugely exciting why these opportunities are coming up. And I think there are at least maybe three fundamental trends that are driving this, and that are really interesting right now. The first is technology. We're seeing the emergence of a whole slew of technologies coming online that mean that it is now radically easier to provide low cost, affordable, and high quality healthcare to markets that previously couldn't do this. So, for example, I was recently in Nairobi. I was visiting a couple of social enterprises out there. We have one of the Making More Health Accelerator ventures, which is sponsored by BI, is Access Afia. They are working in slums in Nairobi, and have found a model that can deliver you know, healthcare at 80% below conventional costs. How do they do that? They do that by having what they call micro clinics, which essentially are clinics that are optimally designed for those kinds of conditions, you know, slum areas, that make a lot of sense. And they equip field workers with smartphones and telemedicine technology, and the ability to combine that means they can deliver an incredible high quality model at rates far below what the market previously could do. So that kind of emergence means that new technology, in particular things like smartphones, for example, to equip field workers or to provide data analytics, enables new business models that we never saw before. You know, so you can now reach remote rural areas and do telemedicine for diagnostics. You can, you know, design healthcare delivery in very radical, smart new ways that don't involve having to go through a clinic to do this. So David Green, the entrepreneur I mentioned at the beginning, who started off with intraocular lenses, his next product was an affordable hearing aid. And he's reduced the price of that by 95% from conventional hearing aids, just by finding ways to do modular Bluetooth technology and turn it into an incredible earpiece that people can use, and then sell them in unconventional distribution channels. So technology is key. The ability then to do radical new business models that can deliver that, you know, think Uber for medicine, you know, shared economy models, telemedicine type models enabled through the smartphone. That's really, really, really powerful. And coupled with that is financing. It's the ability to provide low cost financing to these entrepreneurial solutions. It's also, frankly, the ability to provide consumer finance for the customers. You know, so one of the most exciting things we're seeing in Kenya is the M-Pesa mobile money platform has enabled a lot of new ways of paying that, again, just make it much more accessible for the consumer. It's finance, it's technology, and it's the ability to reinvent these business models that I think is really really exciting. And actually, if I could just maybe just throw in one more trend that we're seeing, it's what I call disintermediation. And what I mean by that is that entrepreneurs are now finding ways to disintermediate the conventional supply and delivery chain for healthcare
Mm-hmm.
in very exciting ways. And so one of my favorite examples of this is a brilliant entrepreneur operating in Tanzania. He's an Englishman named Simon Berry. And he's the entrepreneur behind Coca-Cola's project, Cola Life. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but one of the things that they realized was that Coca-Cola has actually built a world-class distribution system for getting refrigerated beverage to pretty much any part of the world that you can imagine. And so Simon's insight was, well, could we use that and free ride on that in order to be able to deliver medicines, for example, or
Mm-hmm.
vaccines? And so he designed a product called the Cola Pod, where you can put sort of medicines in, and Coca-Cola will actually carry that in their vans. The Cola Pod sits between the crates of Coca-Cola bottles and is transported out to remote rural areas. And it's just an incredible way to get medicines to remote rural areas. And Simon's since gone on from that to find ways to uh, invent new distribution systems. So he's now selling the oral rehydration salts for diarrhea, which is one of the biggest killers of women and children worldwide. But what he's realized is that actually to get it to a mass population, you need to have the salts in a very, very small amount. So he sells them as single sachets, which are sold in corner stores, in Tanzania. And so you don't have to go to a hospital or a clinic for that. So he's found a way to bring the medicine to the community in a much more low cost, affordable, and accessible way. And many, many other entrepreneurs are now doing that as well. So that, I think, is a critical trend that we're seeing, and very exciting.
That's really nice to know, because we had for the second webinar Dr. Sarah Said Khurram, and she runs Sehat Kahani in Pakistan, and she was exactly talking about all of this. So there is a lot of sync in what you are seeing. Use of technology, remodeling of businesses is also something that she mentioned. So I'm sure that this is helpful for the participants, that everybody is actually observing the same trends and seems to be the pattern. I will also like to ask you one very critical question before I start taking question from the participants is, pitching and prototyping is very important, and you have served both as an entrepreneur and as an entrepreneur. You are actually helping a lot of entrepreneur. Can you give us a very specific insight around, and this is something a lot of our participants also want to know, that do you have insights of, like, when it comes to pitching, what is the best formula?
Mm. I've seen a couple of patterns that I think work really well, and so I'd just like to share one of them with the audience. Uh, so when it comes to pitching, I think that normally you only have a few minutes to get your message across. And so you have to be incredibly concise and incredibly precise about exactly what you're going to say. But also, it matters hugely the sequencing and the order in which you make your points. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that kind of a basic mistake that I see a lot of entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs make when they pitch is they start with how much money do they need, right? Or what kind of money. So they'll come and say, hi, I'm looking for $1 million, and it's going to be in equity, and I'm willing to offer 25% of my company in order to blah, 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 blah. And the reason why that's not helpful is because there's a certain sequence that investors are looking for in order to be able to really understand what proposition that you're bringing to them, right? And here are the 4 hot buttons that I think you need to hit. And here's the sequence that I think that I would recommend, unless you've got a really compelling reason not to. The first is the problem, right? So most people are solution-led. They start with their product. Okay, and that's not great, because until you've actually explained the context that you're selling into, it doesn't matter that you've got the world's best dialysis machine. What you need to first hit is how many people are suffering from kidney failure and what is the size of the problem, right? So start with the problem that you're seeking to address, and give at most 1 or 2 statistics just to show the size of the problem. So, there's 7 million people. in West Africa suffering from kidney failure and whatever it might be, right? And so you dimension the problem. The
Mm-hmm.
second thing is you've got to give what I call your critical insight. And what I mean by that is that by definition, if you're bringing a new solution to the market, it is because you have spotted something the market doesn't know. In other words, there's a market failure that's going on. Otherwise, your product would already be in that market, or your solution would already be in that market. So every product or solution is always tied to an insight into why that market is currently deficient, right? And so you have to explain what the insight is. Um, so it could be a cost insight. It could be something like the reason why so many people don't get access to affordable medicine in diarrhea is because that diarrhea medicine is only sold in clinics for $200, per minimum volume, and that's just not affordable to the average consumer.
Mm-hmm.
So and therefore the insight might be, in order to bring it to the consumer, the volume must be reduced massively and the cost must be less than 10 cents. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have that insight, then you explain, as I'm giving Simon Berry's example here. Therefore, I sell my dehydration salts in 10-cent sachets or 1 penny sachets to the consumer direct, and I sell it at their corner store, so they have no need to go to a hospital, which could be 200 miles away, right? So
Yes.
there you packaged up the insight. The reason the consumer is not succeeding here is because the hospital is too far, the product is too expensive, it's not distributed in the right way, etc., etc. Whatever your insight is, that's what your solution has to address. And therefore, I give you this product, and because of those insights, this is why it works, right? If you can do that pivot, so here's the problem, here's the insight into why that problem exists, and here's my solution, then you've got a nice 1, 2, 3 link between those, and now you're carrying the investor along with you on that journey of understanding, right? Okay, there's a very serious problem. This problem has this issue, but my product solves that issue, right? And for the consumer, and therefore that's why this is going to have a big market and why it's going to be successful. And if you can do that, you're 80% of the way there. And then I think there's only 2 more things you have to do. The next thing is you have to explain why are you qualified or specially qualified to bring this solution to that market, right? So if you're an entrepreneur, you need to talk about your credentials, your track record, your qualifications, or your team, or whatever it might be. If you're an entrepreneur, you have to talk about why should your organization be the one to do this, to commit resources to bringing this product or solution to market. What is it
Mm-hmm.
about your resources that makes you specially qualified? So we've been doing this for decades. We have proprietary technology in this space. It would be easy for us to leverage it to this solution. So that's the kind of the uniqueness that you have to do. And then if you do all those 3 things, a clear description of the problem and an insight into why the problem exists, a description of what it is that your solution is about, the solution itself, and then the uniqueness of why you. Then the last bit is the ask. Then at that point, you're ready to go, and we need $1 million to do this in the following way. And I think if you hit those beats in that sequence, I found that to be one of the most successful ways of raising finance.
That's great insight, and I'm sure I'm also going to be remembering that. It's very good tips. I wanted to actually take a question which is very similar, but may not be that similar. It comes from Claudia from Haiti. She's an Ashoka Fellow, and our fellows are also undertaking this course. They find it very useful, and she asks that can you share some tips on the business language that will help people who don't have a background in the business to attract kind of funders or business partners, take an advantage or kind of
Okay.
take an advantage.
Okay, so if you're a social entrepreneur, hi Claudia, by the way, it's great to hear from you. If you're a social entrepreneur who is trying to translate what you're doing into business language, um, you you have to be a little bit careful, okay? Because it's very you have to know the translation, but you also have to know the difference between what a social entrepreneur is trying to do and what a commercial entrepreneur would do. So basically what you do is you map the two together, but at a certain point, you're going to deviate from what happens in the commercial world. So let me just give you a couple of quick examples. Social entrepreneurs typically talk about a social problem, right? There's X number of people in the world who are affected by this issue, and you talk about that, okay? That is the social equivalent of market share, essentially. Oh, sorry, of market size. Okay, so commercial entrepreneurs talk about market size, how many people could be customers of this solution. Social entrepreneurs talk about dimensioning the problem. Okay, so that's one aspect, and I think you can do a fairly good cross connection between those two. Then social entrepreneurs talk about beneficiaries, right? The people that you are trying to help. And commercial entrepreneurs talk about customers, the people that you're trying to sell to. Okay. Now, here's the danger. Sometimes those are one and the same thing, in which case, by all means, use the same language, right? So if you're selling, for example, malarial bed nets, and the people that you're selling it to actually buy that and they're the ones who benefit from that, then fantastic. Speak about beneficiaries as customers, and it's the same thing. However, in many cases for social enterprise, they're not the same thing, right? The people who buy from you are not the same people who are going to benefit necessarily from your product or service. And so this is an important distinction to make. Sometimes they might be people who are buying on behalf of another group. For example, it could be a disaster relief agency that's buying on behalf of the people who are suffering from a disaster. It could be parents buying for children. It could be companies buying for employees, people buying for schools, et cetera, right? So just need to be aware, is there a distinction between customer and beneficiary, or is there not? If there is, you have to be able to spell it out really clearly. And then essentially what you have to do is you have to describe two different models to the investors. Okay, so this is a bit of extra work that you have to do as a social entrepreneur. There's the business model, which is essentially how does your organization make money? So if you are a social business, by definition, you're probably selling something to somebody. Okay, so you need to so that's the commercial language. Here are my customers. Here's what I sell. And here's the profit margin on the unit, on each unit that I sell. Then there's the impact model, which is what is the impact of each unit that I sell, and how many people benefit from that, and what's the benefit of that. So let me give you one example of that, which is not in the medical space, but very, very closely aligned. When I first started out doing social investment, I was raising money for solar energy companies that were providing solar panels for off-grid households. So these were households in remote rural areas that didn't have access to energy, didn't have access to electricity. And so the solution was that we were trying to sell $150 panels that they could put on their roof, and that it would provide them with energy and electricity. And so when we went to raise investment for this, what we had to do was prove that there's a market for this and that people would actually buy this, right? So that was your classic business analysis. There are X million people in Rwanda and Uganda, and they need this product. And we could demonstrate how many of them could afford it and what the economics of that would be. But then we had to then say, but what's the social impact of that? And there's many different social impacts you could talk about. But the one that we picked on was ultimately a cost savings for the consumer, right? So what we were saying was that by buying one of these solar panels, the customer would actually not have to buy kerosene candles, diesel lamps, and basically very expensive, very inferior products. And that even if they were spending $100, they would be making $300, $400 easily over the next 2 years in cost savings, right? And so what you do is you go out there and you give the business case, which is we're going to make this much profit, but then you give the impact case, which is but we're going to save these households millions of dollars. And what you do is you construct a business plan, and this is a core part of the business analysis. You have to construct an analysis which shows how many people will you reach in year 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, based on this. And then that same business plan, based on those projections, gives you how much profit could you generate and how much impact could you generate. And what I recommend is if it's possible to try and have a profit per unit and an impact per unit. So if you can
Mhm.
say, well, by year 5, I'm selling 1 million units of these solar panels, that's going to be, X amount of revenue. 1 million times $5 equals $5 million of revenue. And you can say it's going to be 1 million units times $250 of cost savings for the consumer. Suddenly you've got an impact metric to talk about, and you've got a business metric to talk about, and so that's kind of a very helpful way of thinking about those two things. And then you're tying it into the same plan. So by reaching 1 million in 5 years, you have the economics, and you've also got the impact as well.
Yes, yes. I believe that, now this actually the social investment sector is moving in a way where they are really looking at these things very, very granularly in terms of business plans. Even the non-profit sector has started developing their business plans, have started actually showcasing what they are doing, how they are doing, why they are doing, exactly like how probably a startup will look at things.
Yeah.
So I think that's those tips were very, very pertinent. I'd like to take another question from Heidi Domick, and she's from Chile. Chile is going through a very critical moment at the moment, and her question is also very critical. She's asking that it's usually very difficult in innovating within a state system, or like a systemic input for innovation is very important, very, very difficult. In the state health sector, especially, I'm hoping, Heidi, you meant within government systems. There are resistance, there are barriers of introducing new ideas that actually are bottoms up, comes up from the communities. So can you please tell, like, can you comment basically on the difficulties of innovation in the state health sector, where they are resistant to introducing new ideas that are actually successfully piloted in communities, are shown in communities? Why state or why the government or the systems don't adopt them?
Yeah, yeah. So I think we have many Ashoka Fellows and many social entrepreneurs who are wrestling with this issue. And I have to be honest, I don't think there's any easy solutions to this. I think the government sector is the most conservative and the slowest, frequently, and obviously bureaucratic and challenging in many ways. And so different entrepreneurs have to find different ways of doing it. What can I say that might give chances to maximize success? I think that several things. Firstly, some of the entrepreneurs that we work with basically demonstrate their solution outside of the government sector first. So they take it entirely private, and they might demonstrate that it can work on a private basis, and in a specific area, so that when they do come to look for government contracts, that they are able to have that track record and they can demonstrate that. So I think that if your business plan depends upon convincing the government to adopt an untested product or service and roll it out at scale quickly, that might be too ambitious. But if there's a way that you could find to pilot it in the private sector, or even without government, and then validate the results, and then present that to the government. And again, I would always do this in small bite-sized chunks. So I would always say, can we try it with a couple of hospitals? Can we try it in one district or one
Mm.
region, one area? And then if there's then validation of that, roll it out. I think that strategy tends to be more successful, right? It's almost never do you see a wholesale change happen quickly. Normally,
Mhm.
you pilot, you create, you roll it out, and you may have to get private backers to do that rollout initial testing first. Because I think, again, by the nature of government, they typically only buy solutions when they're quite developed. So you have to incubate it outside and then bring it in. It would be my recommendation on how to do this, but it's not easy. So I totally understand.
Have you seen any examples which has been incubated outside and then probably government has adopted it?
So one example that I think is quite interesting is an organization called Riders for Health. And what Riders for Health do is they provide ambulance services. So they have motorbike couriers, and they operate in, I think, 7 sub-Saharan countries. And essentially what they do is you have a motorbike courier who basically goes out to remote rural areas, typically ones where are not easily accessible by roads. And the motorbike is just a very suitable way of doing that. And they basically take medicines out to those areas, and they bring samples back for diagnosis. So they create that kind of connection with these areas. Riders for Health's been going for, I think, 20 years, and they did the entire thing through their own funding. They created their own model, essentially did it as a non-profit, in fact, but raised millions of dollars doing that, and were able then to reach 25 million people, with their service.
Wow.
So very significant apart from doing that. And because they were able to build such a robust system, they've got fleets of thousands of motorcycle bikes and trained staff. They were subsequently able to go out to several ministries of health and actually win a contract to essentially be the ambulance service for certain areas and regions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they were invited, I think, by Sierra Leone when the Ebola outbreak broke out 2 years ago, to essentially provide those emergency services, and they did it on a commercial basis, and it was very successful. So that's an example of how you build something up to the point where it gets the notice of government, and at that point, it's a much easier proposition than trying to sell it to government from the beginning.
Great. I'm going to take one more question, but before I take that, I'm going to share this with all participants that actually Mark has developed a social investment toolkit. We're going to ask him more about that very soon, and we will be posting the link from where you can learn a lot. The toolkit has quite expansive, information and content that can help you. But before that, one more question that comes from Shyamo the Happy. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your names properly. What advice would you give to starting entrepreneurs in addition to financial and sustainability planning?
With regard to startup entrepreneurs, with regard to financial and sustainability planning. Okay.
In
So I would give.
addition, in addition to financial and sustainability planning.
Got it. Okay. So I think one of the most helpful bits of advice that I wish I had learned a little earlier is to understand that organizations go through several different stages of evolution, and that when you are an early stage startup, what you are trying to do and what you should be doing is quite different from what happens when you are a mature organization, right? And so a mistake which many people make is, and this is particularly true, by the way, of people who come from established corporate careers, where you might be used to an organization with a much higher degree of maturity and resource than a startup is able to enjoy, is that you model the startup on basically being a mini corporation, right? And that's a huge mistake. And it's a mistake because your product or your service is not yet ready for that. So in other words, think about a startup essentially as an organization whose first job is to find the business model, which is going to make sense, and the product and the service, which has the product market fit, right? So you don't know this when you start, and you won't know this until you've actually on the ground working with customers, right? Because what they always say, right? No business plan survives first contact with reality or with your first customer. So you launch with an idea, but only when you're actually working on the ground and actually seeing the idea in practice do you realize all the things that you didn't know. And so the first stage of what you're doing is just getting all the kinks out of the system, the teething issues. You want to perfect the price point, the way it's delivered, the customer presentation, the marketing, all those kinds of things, right? And you literally cannot know this until you're actually on the ground experimenting, right?
Yes.
So when I was working with companies 10 years back that were doing solar products, we went into parts of India and we were selling them, and we were putting them on the roofs of houses. And one of the things we didn't realize was that rats would come up and would bite away at the fastenings, and this was quite a serious problem. So we had to design them in a way that was rat proof. How could you know that until you've actually tried it, right? So you have to experiment and do all these things, and it will take time and it's going to cost money. And it means that you will have to do things that that are not scalable, right? You will have to have an engineer go around and look at it, the first 10 that you do, to work out all these small things that you didn't realize, okay? And there's no way that you can scale that when you go to 1 million. So you have to do it early on, and that's the goal of the startup phase, is to work that out. Okay. Once you've got that, then you can start thinking about scaling up. So again, don't think about 1 million customers on day one. Think about 100 customers. Work out exactly what those 100 customers need in order to be happy and satisfied with your product. Spend the time to get that right with them, and then when you've got that right, then you can go to 1,000, and then 10,000, and then 1 million. Then your organization will switch from or your team will switch from experimentation and prototyping essentially into scaling up and productionizing, right? And that's a whole different set of skills and processes that you have to do. So just be aware that flip has to take place at a certain point, but most people do it too early, or not even aware they need to make that transition into those two things, and that's what causes many problems with startups.
Great. Also, this brings me, because you've been talking so much about expectations, challenges, expectations, and kind of, different kind of resistance. It brings me to my next question to you, which is about like, what do you think are some of the obstacles, challenges, and resistance that you probably see or witness or kind of, encounter in developing or pitching ideas within an organization as an entrepreneur?
Sure. I think a great deal of it is very similar. However, there are a couple of unique things that you're going to find that will come up, and let's just go through a couple of those. So the first one is, by definition, if you're an innovator, you are presenting something which hasn't been done before, and is different and is new. And you're presenting it to an organization that's presumably already active in this space in some way, so it's already the incumbent, right? So the task is actually harder than presenting to an investor who's an impartial third party, because you actually are presenting to somebody who is already invested in the old solution. And so you have to persuade the company or the organization that to invest in something which potentially could be disruptive, or that could be, or is not the way things have been done before, right? And so that's going to be a big challenge. So the way that I recommend to approach this is always to try and break out your ask into small little chunks that you can sell one piece at a time. Make it as easy for your organization to go along with you as you go. And so don't make the mistake of thinking that it's a one-time ask and it's do or die. You're going to work out to do this great business presentation, get in front of the CEO and say, I need $10 million. And they go, no. Okay. So what you do is start with asks that can't be resisted. So start with something like, listen, I think there's an idea here for a new product that we could really do something with that would make a huge difference, and it would be amazing for us. Do you mind if I just go away and just do a study and just work out whether there's any interest in this, right? No one's going to say no to that. But then you come back and you go, oh, I did the study and we got some really interesting results from our potential customers. I think we're onto something here. Do you mind if I go and get your permission to maybe just develop a prototype that we could just try with 10 people? And, and then you come back and you go, oh, the prototype is really getting interesting demand. I think we could, we worked out something that didn't work, but they really like this version of it. And, I think we should, and so basically by doing it in small bite-sized chunks where you lead the sponsor with you, and almost have them on the journey with you as you go back and you report what you discovered, and you come back and build it up again and again, you'll get much more buy-in, you'll get much more understanding, and you won't be overcommitting yourself, right? Again, people's big mistake is, give me some funding, I'm going to go out and I'm going to prove this is going to be a game changer. It's almost never going to be a game changer on iteration 1, but it might be on iteration 10. So what you have to do is buy yourself the capital to get to iteration 10, and the way you do that is just manage expectations, right? I just want to do a study. Yeah, the study suggests this, but we realize that this doesn't work, but this does. And so you keep trying and trying and trying, and then gradually you'll build it up as you go. And so break it out, small chunks, validation as you go, give yourself plenty of room for managed expectations, and don't be afraid to report failure as you go. We tried it, it didn't work, the customer doesn't like that price point, but I'd like to explore a different price point, or I'd like to try and sell it in a different way. And so you're constantly running these experiments, and that's what you're looking for validation on.
Great. And I think one of the most awaited question of the session is that you are the creator of the social investment toolkit. Can you please translate the key elements of the toolkit, especially for the entrepreneurs innovating within the company?
Okay, sure. So let me try. Let me just try. So the origin of the social investment toolkit, and again, if you go to www.socialinvestmenttoolkit.com, you'll see the whole thing laid out. Was a series of online modules that I wrote specifically for social entrepreneurs and social innovators who are looking to raise funding for their projects, and specifically investment. And I wrote this because I wanted to give a lot of case studies and insights like what I'm sharing with you here, just to make this process a little easier for people and to try and demystify it, and also try and remove some of the big mistakes that people make that are easy to avoid if you know about them. And so the way the toolkit is set up is essentially 8 modules that takes you through how to pitch your idea to an investor. And it goes through, it starts off with the foundations, which is about describing the social impact that you want to create, the language that you would use to express that to an investor to get support,
Mhm.
the business model that you want to set up, and how you monetize that, how you make it sustainable. And then it goes through several things like how to build a financial model so that you can come up with a set of projections on how you will grow, how to cost that, how to project how much revenue you will create, how much impact you will create, all the way through to how to pitch it and how to find an investor at the end of the day. So that process is really about securing investment. And the only difference really with for an entrepreneur is that your investor is your organization, right? So and what you're looking for is buy-in. So you might be pitching for money, but at the end of the day, you're also pitching for support, resources, and whatever it might be. So essentially, 90% of it is the same thing. You still have to describe the product, the problem. You still have to describe why the solution. You still have to describe why your organization and your team is well set up to deliver on this solution. And then you make the ask. And so essentially, it's the same structure which I described before. I don't think there's too much that's different, but obviously there is that institutional bias that we spoke about earlier as well.
Great. Also, we have one last question for this session. We didn't realize it's close to 1 hour. The last session from a lot of learners, what they want to say, as you know, this course is being offered to diverse stakeholders. They are social entrepreneurs, they are nonprofit professionals, they are BI employees, and the module that we're talking about is co-creation. So because we have so many stakeholders on the platform itself, they have one common question, which is how can the private sector work with the social sector together? And have you observed any particular trends? And that can be a learning that people can bear in mind.
Right. Yes. So there are a couple of mega trends that I think are taking place right now, which again, I think are super exciting. And I think the biggest one is the convergence of the social sector with the private sector, right? What do I mean by that? Basically, Indrani, I think it's what we alluded to earlier, which is that nonprofits are increasingly adopting techniques and practices from the business world, right? Whether that's
Yes.
methodologies like lean startup, design thinking, agile development, all of those things are very suitable for nonprofit work. And
Mhm.
all the way through to my social investment toolkit, which essentially is a commercial toolkit of finance raising, but adapted for social impact. So there's a lot of technologies and resources that are being brought in that is really helping the nonprofit world to think more rigorously about this. At the same time, what we're seeing is that the business world is now fully acknowledging that social purpose is at the core, or should be at the core of what business is about. You're seeing that with the B Corp movement, which is now proliferating all over the world. You're seeing that with leading CEOs, all over, who are saying we want our company to have social purpose at its core, and that this is really about solving a social mission as well as about making profit, or just making profit. We see that, Boehringer is a great example of that with the Making More Health initiative. I mean, this is very, very substantial collaboration that's taking place. I think that there's a couple of areas that are really important. The first is that we used to think of startups and nonprofits as being quite distant operationally from business. So business would at best just put some cash into those startups and support them. What we're now seeing is that actually there's many more things that could be done than just cash. These include expertise and access to the supply chains and the distribution channels and the infrastructure of the businesses themselves. Boehringer has been not only directly mentoring many of our fellows, but also sending executives to spend time with them, help them upgrade their systems, provide a lot of training, which has been wonderful two-way traffic. But also really looking at partnership opportunities, and I think that's really the way forward, because if you're a startup, it's almost a system that historically has been set up to fail. And the reason is because you may have the best idea in the world, but it won't succeed unless you also have phenomenal execution, phenomenal finance, phenomenal branding, phenomenal marketing, and great resources and a lot of luck, right? Now, why should any team have all of those things at the same time? It's an extremely unlikely combination that will happen. So if business can come in and say, listen, we can take a lot of that burden off you by providing you with resources, marketing, website, IT, operations, and so on, and have the entrepreneurial team really focus on what they're amazing at, that's a much, much better way to get social innovation out there faster, and not have great ideas fail because there was some aspect of execution that wasn't right, and that that they didn't have the best accountancy in the world or the best IT, and therefore that the great idea failed. That's a really inefficient way of doing things. And so we're seeing a lot more of business support, operational and logistics support for innovation, which is I think tremendous, and I hope that will continue.
Great. And the last question for the session, do you have any parting advice for the entrepreneurs who are taking the course? And also, does pitching has any other connotation? Because we've been talking a lot about ideas and getting it financed and looking at stakeholders. Do you think pitching, because pitching also means convincing, and you don't always have to just sell, you also have to sometimes convince. So do you think it has any other connotation?
Ah, interesting. So advice for entrepreneurs. Well, firstly, congratulations on being an entrepreneur. I think you guys are the pioneers of what I think will become a mass movement across business generally. So my hope will be that in the years to come, everyone will be an entrepreneur and will think entrepreneurially. So I think that having the skills and the opportunity to try it out and practice is fantastic. I do not think it can damage your career in any way, and will really enhance it. And the skills that you get from doing this will be tremendous. And what I would my only bit of advice would be, there's almost no way to fail in doing this, because if you try and launch something and initiate it, your organization learns and you learn so much from doing that. So my mantra is always dream big but start small and act fast, right? And what I mean by that is set yourself an ambitious goal, but the key to success is just fearlessly go out there, but just start very small. One pilot, one experiment, one prototype, and then build from there, and watch it grow. And the secret to an entrepreneurial journey, I believe, is that don't put yourself in a situation where it can be a binary do or die, and don't think in that way. It's never do or die. It's always, we tried this, and now we've learned this, and now we're going to pivot to this, or move on from that. So you need to be unstoppable, and the way you are is you just make sure that everything that you do, there's always a way round or through or up, and that's a beautiful entrepreneurial mindset to have. And then on the question around pitching, does it have any other connotations? Yeah, I think you're always pitching. It's anytime you're looking for help, resources, partnership, co-creation with someone else. It's this is an essential skill of life, is how to convince and bring people on board. And so I think having that skill set is really important. And I would think of it as really, the foundation of this is empathy. It's understanding what where the other side is, what do they understand, and what can they gain from this, right? One of the things I always say to my investees who are pitching for investment is, remember, the investor also needs to invest, right? If you are an investor, you actually have to find investments, or you have failed as an investor. And so it's not a one-way track. It's not a one-way street where there's just one group that blesses another with their capital. It's both ways. And so just remember that if you're an entrepreneur with a great idea, people will fight to invest in you. Okay, so be very confident in what you're doing, and make and remember the value of what you're doing as well. So good ideas and great teams are extremely rare and hard to come by. And so if you are that, then you have a very valuable commodity, and you should be very proud of that. So I really wish all of you the very best, and thank you for inviting me onto this conversation.
Thank you so much, Mark. Mark is joining from Japan. It is middle of the night and he has so much of energy. What a session it was. Fantastic experience sharing, so much of knowledge. And of course, we all are going to be diving into the social investment toolkit to see how our ideas can be kind of facilitated through that knowledge and through that content. Thank you so much, Mark, for your time. And thank you so much for all the insights that you've shared all the while. I'm sure that this session will actually help all the learners probably have a better insight to undertake your assignments now, because you will have assignments for module 4 and 5 that probably you're in the verge of already submitting. We are also coming closer to the end of the course. So next week, you will have the last webinar of the season hosted by my colleague, Sharon Beckford, who will be joined by Philip Baum from PI. And hope you have enjoyed the course so far. Before we sign off, I will like to remind you, please to take the live survey where we've asked, if you're watching us live, please say yes, you get your extra points for that. Thank you for being an amazing audience, so interactive, so engaged. And we look forward to talking to you next week again.